Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to tackle one of the early war Germans from Bolt Action. This is one of the plastic kits from Warlord Games, and I have done something very similar before. But what I'm going to do today is actually show you a two-stage kind of process where you can go up to what I guess in most circles is called battle ready, painted and ready for the table, versus taking them a little bit further and really pushing the result to something that'll look quite nice. Now there are one or two details unique to these sort of early war miniatures, which I do spend a bit of time talking about in this video. This one will be a little bit longer as a result, so I'm going to make sure that the little chapters function down in the bottom there will work, so you can skip around as you need to. All of the paints will be listed in the description below, so let's get started. Now to begin with, I've primed this fella with a spray of Fieldgrey from Vallejo. Now you could spray him with a ordinary grey, something like Uniform Grey from the Army Painter or Mechanicus Standard Grey from Citadel. It's not really going to matter. What I would suggest though is if you can get German Fieldgrey primer, you'll find it easier to prime him in green and paint these details over that versus starting with grey and having to paint the jacket. It's a minor difference, and one I bring up mostly as a point of I'm just doing it slightly differently this time, but bear that in mind. If you can get that primer, it'll save you a bunch of time. Now, the very first thing we're going to paint on this fella is his skin. Now, there's not really a right way of doing this. It's up to you what you like the look of. Because I'm going to shade this later, I want a fairly light sort of skin tone. So I'm going to use here, this is Barbarian Flesh from the Army Painter. Now I've got just a little bit of water in my paint here. You'll see it's not going to cover perfectly. We do get some streaking. When it comes to the strap on his helmet, just paint straight over the top of it. And go as far back as you dare for his head. Don't forget his hands too. This will probably take 2 coats to get you a nice solid color. And make sure you leave this one to dry thoroughly first. Now, no matter which skin tone you do choose, you want to make sure that you have got a nice solid color before you carry on with the rest of the miniature. So 2 or even 3 coats, whatever's necessary. And I will link in the description a couple of alternatives if you don't want to use the Army Painter color there. Now, a detail that I don't see done very often is these early war jackets. In the very early stages of the war, actually had a felted collar. So the jacket itself was Fieldgrey, or Feldgrau, but the collar would then have a slightly deeper green, and for this I'm using Vallejo German Uniform. This is a nice sort of bottle green color. You could also use a darker green here if you wanted, but again, because we're going to shade this, that's probably going to take care of that. I'm going to switch on down to a smaller brush, and we'll just give this one quick coat of German Uniform around the collar. Now, a detail that stands out as a little unusual on these particular plastic miniatures is this gas cape pouch on the chest. This is being worn in the alert position, meaning he'd have easy access to it. It was normally something that you'd wear if you were assaulting an enemy position, but it's not something that would have been worn this way terribly often. It's an odd detail, but it is technically accurate, so we'll paint it. There was 2 ways that these were done. There was either a dark sort of rubberized container, or there was a cloth one. And though the rubberized one is sort of considered a bit more early war, they were both made throughout the whole war, so either is accurate. I'm using here olive grey. This is a really dark green, but it will stand out against the jacket. So this will probably cover in just 1 coat, and as you can see, very quick to do. Now at the same time, make sure you're painting the strap in that same color. It'll just make it a lot easier than having to paint it something else later on. Now I've got Basalt Grey, and I'm going to use this for his trousers. I really like this because it's got a very slight blue tone to it. So let's just pop this over his trousers. When you come near his jacket, slow down a little bit. But when it comes to painting his boots and what have you, since we're going to paint those black later, you don't need to worry too much about hitting them. So this will cover very well, and you'll probably find 1 coat later you'll have grey trousers. Now while that dries, we can spin him around and pay some attention to his equipment. Now there is a wonderful resource online, mp44.nl, and I will link that in the description. It has color photographs of original and reproduction versions of this equipment, which I have found absolutely invaluable. We're going to start off with the bread bag, since it's the lowest part there, and I'm just going to use khaki for this. You could use a more green color, something like grey-green for example, but once we shade this, this is going to look plenty green. So let's cover over the bread bag, and at the same time you can cover over his tent roll as well. It's not going to be khaki, but that will make the next step much easier. I've got here Camo olive green, and we're going to paint in his gas mask canister. And then some flat earth for the felt cover of his water bottle. Now you can use pretty much any brown that you like here. Personally, I tend to think this one looks the closest to authentic, but you know, like I said, go take a look at the color photos that you'll see, and you can decide what you like the look of. Almost any brown will do the job here. Now we'll apply some dark sand over the tent roll, and you'll see straight away why that khaki makes this so much easier. Then grab yourself a brush with a nice point and some German Camo pale brown. Whew, the names on these, I tell you. And we're going to paint just little jagged edges for a sort of pretend camo effect on our tent roll. Don't worry if this is not perfect, it's not the Mona Lisa. Now that's not finished, but that is where we're going to leave it for now. We're going to come back and add leather and brown details to that later, but at the moment that's perfect. So I've got now beige brown, and we're going to apply this to all of the wooden details. So get a little off my brush there. And let's just paint all over the rifle. Don't worry about the black bits, we're going to cover those later. And any wooden details, like if he's got an entrenching tool. And this fella, he's got a grenade sticking out of his boot. You will barely notice this little brown section here, but paint it anyway, just for completion's sake. And we'll paint the black on his boot. Now we're going to move on and paint some leather details. Now for this, there's really two options, either literally leather brown or flat brown. Now leather brown tends to be quite dark, and it will look really good after a shade, whereas flat brown by comparison has a slightly warmer, very slightly red tint to it, which I think, once we've shaded, is going to look more like that sort of careworn leather that you see in equipment of the time. It's up to you. Either one is, of course, as close to accurate as you need it to be. I'm going to go with flat brown for my leather, however. So that's going to mean we'll start with the rifle strap, give that a quick splat of our flat brown, and I'm going to switch to a smaller brush and paint in these straps on the back of the equipment there. Now when it comes to the boots and the other areas of dark leather, I've got here just black, and I'm going to use my medium brush to paint in larger areas first, and then we're going to swap to a smaller brush to paint in his webbing, the details on his rifle, anything else which is going to be black here and you're going to need a bit more control for. So don't forget his ammo pouches too, and yeah, anything which is going to be black. Now of all the stages here, that's the one which is probably going to take the longest. You want to be careful if you can, but don't worry too much if you do make any mistakes, because we're going to leave our tidy up stage till last. Now, this German fella needs a grey helmet, so for that we're going to use German grey. No great surprise there. This is a really dark grey. It will dry almost black, but both this and the top of his potato masher grenade you're going to want to paint with a quick coat of this. And now finally for the base coats, I'm going back to some German Fieldgrey, and I'm just going to tidy up any areas where I went a little overboard with some of those other colours. So on his sleeves is normally a really good spot for this. Just a quick tidy up here. Any other colours you need to, you can of course fix up now. You want to do that before we apply our shade. Now once all of those base coats have been tidied up and he's ready for his shade, I'm going to use here my mix of 1:1 strong tone and quick shade mixing medium from the Army Painter. Now, because I use so much of this, I've got one of these little pots from Amazon and just mixed myself up a whole bottle of it. I do recommend, even if you switch to something like Angriff's Earthshade, use a medium to thin it out about 1:1. We want the shading, but we don't want to change the color very much. So let's pop some of this out onto my palette. And then we're going to apply this to the entire miniature. Now, I would suggest you don't want to go overboard with this. You're really only looking to get it into recesses, but if you don't paint it over flat areas, it's going to look a little peculiar. So coat the whole thing, and anywhere that it pulls in a big way, you can sort of draw it away while it is still wet. So I'm not using the biggest brush that I could here, let's say. Let's just go around now. And once this is applied, you want to give it about probably 20 to 30 minutes to dry. Now after that half an hour, here's what you'll have. And I tend to say all the time, what you could do now would be to varnish him and base him up and he'll be ready for the table. And then I don't do it. I don't show you that. So this time what I'm going to do, I'm going to varnish him, base him, and then we'll carry on painting and add a few extra details. So a matte varnish, I'm going to use the Vallejo spray and a quick base. Let's see what that looks like, really ready for the table. The most important thing that the varnish does is to take that shine off from the shade that we used, and that's not a bad finish. If you were to put a whole army down that looked like this, he'd look fine, he'd look fantastic. But we can take it a little further, and I don't think it's terribly difficult to do that, so if you want to spend some extra time, let's keep going. I'm going to go back to my German grey, and over these shaded areas, I'm going to just concentrate towards the top of his helmet and down the bottom here. Just a little bit of extra colour, and that will be quite subtle on camera, unfortunately. But in reality, that will help brighten up that helmet a bit. That will look much nicer. Now for his tunic, I'm actually going to switch up to an army painter colour called, well, Fieldgrey. Reason being, this is quite a lot lighter than the Vallejo Fieldgrey, so it actually makes an ideal highlight colour. So let's spin him around, and this section here on his pocket and along the bottom of his jacket is a good spot to show this. Let's add just a little bit of the brighter Fieldgrey. I might swap to a smaller brush in a second. But we want to just highlight some of these areas to accentuate the folds in the clothes and any big flat areas like so. Now by concentrating on the flatter areas and leaving the shaded areas intact, you're going to get a neat sort of folded, creased uniform effect like that. Now this is a technique which I reckon takes a bit of practice, but you can just look at examples on the website if you want to get a look at how the painting team has done that, because it'll give you some pretty good ideas. I do want just one last highlight on the jacket, because now I'm being fussy, and I'm going to use Army Painter Filthy Cape for this. Now this one I want to use very sparingly, just a little at the very edges of some of these areas of detail. So on pockets and stuff like that, this is also a good spot to brighten up some of the detail on his chest. Now sticking to Army Painter colours, we're going to do something similar to his trousers. I mentioned Uniform Grey as a primer colour. Well, here it is. I'm going to use it as his trousers. So we're going to do the same thing, concentrating on flatter areas, and we're going to paint in the trousers with a quick layer of Uniform Grey. Now if you do want to highlight his trousers further, you could go to a lighter grey or just mix in a tiny wee bit of white there. It's really up to you. I'm not going to go to quite the same level as I did with his jacket though, because well, you're not going to see those trousers. So it gives us an opportunity to continue using Basalt Grey. And for this, I'm just going to do a tiny wee bit along the edges of his helmet. Now when it comes to the bottom rim, just flip him sort of sideways there. Let's see if I can get that on camera. And you can use the side of your brush rather than the tip, just to lightly drag along the edge there and get that nice sharp highlight. Mind that you don't hit his collar while you're doing this though. Now what I'm going to introduce you to is the almost universal highlight color. Now this is a great mix, ivory, because it's not as sharp as a pure white. So when you're mixing it into colors that you want to highlight, it's not going to give you so weird a transition of color. You only want to use a very little amount of it each time though. So I'm going to pop some of this out onto my palette. And then with some of that off to the side, I'm going to get the colors that I want to highlight. So I have here a little bit of olive grey. Now I'm going to do the same thing with all of the colors that I want to highlight using this technique. So I'm going to do this on his gas cape pouch and the bread bag. Maybe one or two others, but you can be the judge of that. So grab yourself, first of all, just a tiny wee touch of ivory. And, well, that's not going to do anything, is it? So let's rip that off. Get some more. And you can slowly mix in just an incremental amount each time until you've got, yeah, that'll make for a fairly decent highlight. So, as mentioned, let's grab that now, and I'm going to add a little bit of this just to the edges of his gas cape pouch. So you'll see that because this is essentially made up from, the base color, it's not going to be, oops, that's a little bit off, it's not going to be so sharp against that color, and that's going to look just fine. So I'm now going to do that to a couple of the colors on his webbing. Now with just that tiny dollop of ivory, I was able to highlight both the khaki on his bread bag and even the camo olive green, goodness, on his pack there. And I did also do a little bit on his trousers too. So extremely versatile. Pick up yourself some ivory, get used to mixing colors. It really will help a lot. Now from here, I've got a little bit of black grey. This is a slight bit lighter than German grey. And if you want to, you can use this to highlight the black leather. Now, I would suggest at this stage, we're really just mucking around. But if you do want to spend that extra time, you can make this look rather good. Now we'll grab a little bit of off-white, which I tend to find just flows more easily than pure white does, and is indistinguishable to the naked eye. So with off-white, we're going to paint in his collar tabs, and these little branch of service things on his shoulder. So don't worry too much if you do hit the center of the shoulder boards, because you can just go back with some Fieldgrey. Now when it comes to finishing off his skin, I'm going to use a little bit of corpse pale, still from the army painter here, and just paint in the backs of his knuckles, his nose, his cheekbones, that sort of thing. Now, corpse pale is a pretty good name for that color because he's going to look practically translucent. I've got a little Reichland flesh shade from Citadel, but you could use the Army Painter's Flesh Wash here. I just like a little bit more of the red tone in this one. We're going to apply just a little of this over the skin again, and that will give us a slightly more reasonable skin tone. So don't go nuts with it, just enough to introduce a little bit of warmth back to that skin. And then finally, like for real at last, finally, get yourself a little bit of gunmetal. This is a Vallejo air color, but it works perfectly well coming out of a brush. And let's just highlight some of the metal areas with a little bit of this. Then what I'm going to do is take them out and give them another varnish. If you were going to paint up to this level to begin with, I would suggest you don't want to varnish them twice ordinarily. I just have to because I wanted to show you what he would look like, finished. But let's come back and have a look at what the really finished version of this guy will look like. And then, at long last, our early war German soldier is complete. Now, I reckon if you put a whole army that looks like this down on the table, you've pretty much won already. Although the time taken on this one does really remind me why I ordinarily stick to just dry brushing my armies. It's a matter of how much time you want to spend, but the results, I think, they are really nice if you do want to go that little bit further. So thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support is invaluable, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.